Question 1. What is postmodernity? Well, the shortest answer could be a counter-movement, so a reaction to modernism, modernist architecture, and the radical rethinking of modernist theory. In specific, the simplification and universalizing styles, the absence of cultural meaning, its ahistorical mode of design renouncing any reference to historical tradition, and its ignorance of the physical context. So, of course, that was the statement that was put out. And this led to an explosion of new radical approaches to architecture, to design and methodology, and a collection of many different collectives and positions in parallel. So we will come more to that in the second question, but just highlighting what we find interesting in particular are the experimental and playful attitudes that were invented to transgress the established. Also, the reasserted focus on context and cultural meaning plays for us an important role in architecture.
Question 2. Which figure from the first generation of postmodernists do you consider particularly relevant to your work? Well, we don't consider ourselves postmodern, but we do find interesting some specific approaches and methodologies and critical concepts that were initiated during this movement, such as the use of many different formats, working in photography, film, video, performance, drawing, photo collage, sculpture, in the form of large-scale interventions into existing architecture. We were also intrigued by the critical concepts and playful interrogations of spaces influenced by architects such as Fostel Dickens from Fantastic Architecture. We are also interested in the use of the city stage, the focus on context, on the close relationship of new architecture with the existing urban environment, as put forward yet in different ways by architects like Aulenti. And finally, if we think of the radical Italian collectives of the 70s, led by Sozzas, Petena, among others, and in specific how they, through the use of ephemeral structures and performative acts, expanded the notion of public space as a catalyst for the collective imagination, as a playground for all.
We have a couple examples of how this somehow is relevant or relates to how we approach the practice. So one example would be the larger project called Evidence of the Absent, which we developed in a 1-year residency. So this was a self-initiated research project on simulation tools that are used within the context of the city in the scale 1:1, which we find extremely interesting because they somehow have the scale 1:1, they relate to the context of the city and they are there, constructed, but always fragmented. So they always only show one aspect of a future building. The materiality, the contour, so there's always something shown and something hidden. And one performative act that we did, one of the first ones, so really an action, was taking these printed textiles that are placed in front of facades to show what is going to come as a tool to go into the city and relate them to new contexts, opening a dialogue with residents, of course, the people that are used, the tools are communication tools, no? So what happens? How do we relate to that? So playing with what it actually is, material-wise. Then, within Evidence of the Absent, we found it extremely interesting to think further, what does it actually mean to complete an image if you only have a fragmented depiction of it? And in the scale 1:1, you require your physical interaction with that, leading us to do a series of experiments, even inviting people from different disciplines like dance and music to elaborate on the physical interaction we can have with architecture or architecture yet to come, which in the end led us to develop really a method of how we approach research and design, which is called on-site explorations. And one example here is going into a site in Zurich together with an invited dancer, and really trying to connect the poles of a Baugespan, which is a method used to only simulate a building to come by marking out its contour on the corner points with very thin aluminum poles. And we trace the connections between these poles, which was somehow very interesting in the scale 1:1, but also extremely difficult because you can interpret these connections in very different ways if that's the only thing you have. So playing with improvisation and suggestion, physical interaction became something extremely important for our practice after doing these exercises. And we applied that as an experiment for how to actually use this physical interaction with the site in the scale 1:1 with students in Antwerp in 2020 as part of the International Design Week. And we tried to trace connections inside a large park in Antwerpen Luchtbal, challenging the students, and ourselves, to use their body. So not go draw first on a small piece of paper, which somehow could be limiting, but going into this big field that somehow requires your physical interaction to understand the huge scale. And what would it lead to? The concept of a bench somehow explored through our bodies. And by doing this act, we came to a bench of 35 meters long in different heights that also was directing in different directions of potential connections within this area.
The third question is, what role does architectural history play in shaping your work? Okay, the starting point for any of our project can be local, specific situation. By translating both physical and invisible embedded qualities or characteristics into an architectural intervention, we endeavor to make a layered reading for the context visible and experienceable, and bring it to the attention of a larger audience. This can be something historical, a local history, or something yet to come, a projection of the future, as Alexandra was explaining in the previous chapter. The elaboration of a local history played a role in, for instance, the project Along the Line that we self-initiated in Yverdon-les-Bains in Switzerland in 2018. Here we have studied the changeability of the landscape, where, as a consequence of the water correction, the water height of the lake decreased with 2.7 meters and the shoreline with 400 meters from the city center of Yverdon, affecting the historical relationship between the city and the lake. Exactly 150 years ago, we created, 150 years after, we created a new scenographical path that subtly visualized this original shoreline with the present situation. And for us was kind of a gift for the citizens and the city, for them to have this awareness of what once was their city, how the landscape was, and the importance of also bringing awareness of such important topics in public space. And then I give maybe a word to Ale.
And then somehow reversing this, so not the history, but the future. So how to integrate a future situation in the present is something we, for instance, did in the project Learning from Venice, which is an ongoing research project that we also included while teaching at the Rotterdam Academy of Architecture last semester. And we addressed climate change, in specific the topic of flooding. And we challenged the students to already imagine, but also make the future transformations that are going to happen because of the flooding already visible in the existing scenario, both by using maps, but also, again, this on-site exploration, so going on-site and really trying to trace, to mark, to visualize with very simple means the future level impact of what the flooding would have on the island of the Northern Island in Rotterdam, which really is already facing the challenge of flooding. We see how this affects existing elements such as streets, parks, entrances. So within our public space, gives us a reason to question them, to rethink them, both in the architectural and the urban scale.
And then maybe we can go to the fourth question. The question is tricky, and we tried hard to give an answer. Maybe we went a bit tangential, but the question is, how does your approach to history differ from that of the first generations of postmodernists? Well, for us, the relation with history today is very different than in the postmodern time, of course. Whereas postmodernism raised from the reaction to the previous movement, modernism, our time doesn't have one particular movement rather than many or known. So for us today, the focus isn't so much about the history. We never start a project reflecting on the history, but rather on contemporary urgencies such as climate change, finite material resources, and search for community engagement through architecture, and how we as architects can or should relate to them. This is maybe the most important thing for us. And started from the necessity to forge a new consciousness about this fast-paced urban transformation that we saw rapidly changing the cultural and physical identities of our cities. We decided in 2017 to collaborate and to start our office Rotative studio with a very long list of topics awaiting to be researched. We started with the project of waterfront in Belgrade, and then we shifted the same questions in different cities in Europe, passing by Barcelona, my original city, going to Rotterdam, the city of Alexandra, and coming back to Zurich, where I'm living now, and also establishing a dialogue between these four cities and looking at the topic from these different perspectives. And that's why we started our studio back in 2017, not with a business plan, but rather with a manifesto, a bit naive manifesto, but quite playful and kind of a reaction. Is quite of a reactionary statement, where we wrote out our need to react and reflect on these contemporary issues, questioning the role of architects can take concerning these local and global issues.
Let's go to the fifth question. What is the role of figuration in your work? So we answer in how we interpret the question. So we understand design or architectural design as a process of exploring, reflecting, and concretizing, a process that is never finished but rather continuous and interrelated. So that is how we work and how we approach our work. So through the development of different research projects, experiments, and studies, we have created our own formal language of elementary, essential shapes, forms, rhythms, compositions, and color. And in particular, we find it interesting to have somehow a very balanced, elementary approach to the form and to rhythm, but also to include somehow a disruption of this rhythm, to introduce an element of surprise and play. For this, so now taking another inspiration or maybe an influence is also minimal art, conceptual art, the movements led by Dan Graham, Lewitt, Albers, that happened in between modernism and postmodernism. So somehow this shift from modernism to postmodernism also had these other movements within the art discourse, which also we are influenced by or inspired with. And their search for abstraction and color, the skill and the use of minimal means, and installations in specific. So we have taken one project, 3 pavilions in Aigle, a temporary project for the Place du Marché, the central square there. It is a good example on how we have implemented this formal language in relation to an existing context in transformation. These 3 pavilions are designed all as part of the same family, yet each with their own specific functions, proportions, and color palette. Inspired by the interplay of rigid lines and curves in the surrounding landscape of vineyards, the pavilions are built up of a steel structure on the exterior with clear vertical and horizontal lines, each one interrupted by a circular geometry that frames a particular view. The lines in the elevations follow a strong rhythm in relation to the openings behind. Even though designed as a modular system, we found it very important to bring irregularity here in each one of them. So an interplay of symmetry, geometries, and various rhythms within the structure and the surfaces and generous openings behind. The pavilions host a diverse but clear material palette of natural wood and steel with aluminum details. It's a color palette of red, blue, and green tones that introduce a new identity to the square in dialogue with the context. And the colors find their way into each pavilion every time in another constellation.
Well, and then we arrive to the last question. What makes postmodernity relevant in current times? We think that postmodernity has led to transgress the borders of our discipline while encouraging experimentation and dialogue with art and other disciplines, that architecture is more than the build. It has expanded towards a discussion around it, raising questions, reflect and react on contemporary issues, on how we do the profession. Also that architecture needs to open up and engage more with the public. Architecture as communication and as a stimulus, a gesture. Through minimal means, we can make a large impact. For example, we can revitalize public space. Even the context of the city itself can become a stage for raising questions and open up a dialogue with others. We also think that postmodernism have opened up other ways to engage with architecture, with a context that you are actually designing for, in which any new building or transformation takes place. And finally, we think that postmodernity has inspired young practitioners like us to open up new ways of doing architecture and allowing them to combine different approaches and formats, and mostly also the possibility of organizing in collectives to operate in collaborative way. This is what we think it is the influence of postmodernity.
It's how we work, also the two of us, in a constant dialogue.